911, what are you reporting?
I got a strange going on out here. Something just killed my dog.
Something killed your dog?
My dog went flying through the air over the tree. I don't know how it did it.
Okay.
Damn it, I'm really confused. All I saw was my dog coming over the fence, and he was dead when she hit the ground. I didn't see any cars. All I saw was my dog coming over the fence.
What are you reporting?
We got someone or something crawling around out here.
Did you see what it was?
It was standing up. I'm out here looking through the window now and I don't see anything. I don't want to go outside. Jesus Christ, you better...
Sure.
See ya!
Hello?
Get somebody out here.
What's going on now, sir?
That son of a bitch is about 6'9", I don't know.
Do you see him now, sir?
Yes, I'm looking right at him.
Uh-oh.
Here's a word that you don't hear very often: verisimilitude. It doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. It's not the sort of word that's easily woven into a brief soundbite or a meme or a tweet, but it's very relevant to the wood ape or Sasquatch phenomenon. Verisimilitude is defined as having the appearance of being true or real. As such, it's patently different from empirical truth, objective reality, or fact. The primary aim of scientific inquiry itself is, indeed, empirical truth. The path taken while pursuing that aim likely meanders through the landscape of credible verisimilitude, but that's not the final destination. For the well-informed researcher of the Sasquatch phenomenon, the subject itself is richly complex and smacks with verisimilitude. The most credible testimonial reports of observations and encounters reveal biological and ecological trends and norms that are consistent with those in the extant apes. Moreover, the historical context from whence these reports emerge often precede or anticipate our discovery or confirmation of those trends within the known apes. The most relevant analyses of the best physical evidence also suggest a biological North American ape in that they conform to characteristics of both extant and extinct apes, and again precede many of the discoveries that illuminate the conformities and consistencies. A thorough review of the best testimonial and physical evidence reveals at least a strong appearance of a biological reality at the core of the Sasquatch phenomenon. That's been the overarching argument made by Sasquatch proponents for decades now. In that regard, the Sasquatch subject has, in my estimation, reached peak credible verisimilitude. In fact, I'd say it's occupied this position of peak credible verisimilitude for so long that it's actually begun to erode and wither with the stagnation of progress along that aforementioned path towards empirical truth. Outlandish claims, ridiculous interpretations, and outright lies and fabrications have all contributed to this erosion, and will continue to do so for as long as this subject remains sedentary in the liminal space between appearing valid and being empirically validated. There's a gap, a seemingly massive gulf between credible verisimilitude and truth. This is the proverbial gap between real or not real. The gap that prompts all contenders with the Sasquatch to ask the question as to whether or not the Sasquatch exists. By now, it should be painfully obvious to Sasquatch proponents that the only thing that could or would bridge this gap is an individual representative of the species, i.e., a specimen. You see, critics, skeptics, and cynics have known and accepted this fact for a very long time, but for some reason proponents often have the proclivity to ignore or deny that fact, opting instead to collect the same sorts of evidence that have been collected in abundance for 60 years in hopes that credible verisimilitude will eventually just become a proxy for empirical truth. That hasn't happened yet, and it probably never will. Now, a specimen can take many forms. It could be a living individual, captured and brought in to be observed and documented by scientific, academic, or governmental institutions. It could be the partial remains of a long-deceased individual, some diagnostic portion that could serve as the type for the species that leads to their recognition. Or it could be a specimen that's collected, that is, to obtain an entire individual representative by means that would allow for the retrieval of the complete specimen for quantitative study and analysis long into the future. All of these options have been used to list and recognize animal species in the past, and therefore, if the wood ape exists, all of those options are available to those who seek to bridge this gap now. These are all very difficult options to pursue for various reasons.
guys, and welcome to this week's episode of Sasquatch Odyssey. Thank you guys so much for taking time out of your schedule to be with us for the show. We've got a great guest lined up for you, but as always, I want to start by inviting you. If you've had an encounter and you'd like to be on the show, shoot me an email. You can get me at brian@sasquatchodyssey.net. If you haven't already done so, go over and check out the premium content section. You can become a member there and help support the show. I want to start the show tonight by giving a huge thanks to you guys. I started the new show, Paranormal Odyssey, last week. I've posted a couple of shows. I've posted a UFO show over there, and I've posted a Dogman show over there. And you guys have shown up in a huge way. So thank you so much for helping to make that a success already. We've got some amazing things coming up on that show. It's more about the paranormal. It's more about UFOs, ghost stories, Dogman encounters, things outside the realm of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, that kind of thing. So we've got some great guests lined up already. I'm excited. I've got Paul Eno. You guys may not recognize him, but he's celebrating 50 years investigating the paranormal. He worked with Ed and Lorraine Warren on some of their major cases, if you're familiar with them from the Conjuring movies. Super nice guy. I've got him lined up for the show. I'm super excited to have that conversation, so you guys tune in for that. I'll be posting another UFO show over there on Sunday, so make sure you go over and check that out. I'll put a link to that show in the show notes for this show. We've also got another investigator coming on. I won't give her name yet, but I do have her lined up for the show. She has direct contact and direct knowledge of what happened during the Betty and Barney Hill UFO abduction case. So I'm excited to talk to her as well. So I'll announce that a little bit closer to showtime, but in the meantime, we've got a great guest over here on Sasquatch Odyssey. This guy, I met him up at the Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Conference last week. He was the MC of the event. His name is Matt Pruitt. He's a member of the North American Wood Ape Conservancy. We'll talk a little bit about that tonight. He's an investigator. He's an historian. He's working on a book project right now. He also helps to produce and edit Bigfoot and Beyond for Cliff and Bobo, so big shout out to those guys. Matt does a great job on that show, as do they. This guy's going to blow your mind. After this interview, I think I know my Bigfoot IQ points went up like 20. I'm sure my overall IQ is up probably like 35 after talking to Matt. He's a super smart guy. Great conversation. I'm excited that you guys get to hear him. He's on the line. He is ready to go, so I'm going to stop talking, let the music play. You guys sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. All right, folks, I want to welcome our guest tonight, Matt Pruitt, to the show. Welcome to the show, man.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to chat with you.
Absolutely. I know we got to hang out a little bit at the Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Conference about a week ago, and it was awesome that you took the time to say hello. You were busy with your emceeing duties up there, which I thought you were great at, by the way. I thought it was a great conference, and you did a great job wrangling the cats and getting everybody on the stage and introduced properly. And I thought it was a great experience, man. It was my first Bigfoot conference, so it was exciting to get up there and hang out with some of the greats and to get to see you, man. And I really appreciate that you emceed the event and took time to say hello. It was great.
Oh, certainly. It was great to meet you. I recognized the logo on your shirt, so that's why I took a shot in the dark and said, "Hey, Brian," I was like, I figured that's got to be him because I don't really use social media that much. So I didn't have a picture or anything like that to go on. So, but yeah, the organizers of that event are real professionals. They're actual event organizers. So they put together a really well-run event. I spoke at the inaugural Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Conference in 2019 with Cliff Barrickman and a few other speakers, and it was a blast. And they organized a second event later that year that Bobo spoke at. So I helped Bobo. I drove him out there and ran his merch table with him. And every event of theirs I've seen has been very well organized and well run. So when they asked me to MC, it was like, oh, of course, I'd love to. And, I'm not terribly far away. I live in Nashville, Tennessee. So it's right down the road to Gatlinburg, and always fun to be in the Smokies for a weekend. So it was all in all, a really positive experience. I think there were something like 2,000 attendees, and everyone I spoke to was so kind and generous and really friendly. So it was a great weekend for sure.
Yeah, it was definitely fun, man. And I think one of the things I was looking forward to the most was the segment where they let the folks with the experiences. Obviously, I do an experience-based podcast, and I document the encounters, and I was really curious to see, how that was going to be handled. And I thought it was great that they got to bring those people up on the stage and just embrace their stories, let them tell their stories in their own words. And it was fascinating. I got to talk to a couple of the folks that shared their stories, and I gave them my business card, and hopefully would like to get them on the show if they're willing to share the stories, because that's one of the reasons that I love doing a show like this that's encounter based. Is people have very difficult encounters. I mean, most of the encounters are not, singing Kumbaya, holding hands, strolling through the woods with Sasquatch. A lot of these encounters, there's a lot of PTSD and a lot of things that come along with that. So it's great to see a conference setting like that that's sort of recognizing that people have experiences they want to share and giving them that 10 or 15 minutes or whatever it is to get up and take the mic and actually be in a room full of people that don't think you're crazy and tell your story. And I thought that was pretty powerful. And one of the ladies that I talked to that was on the stage afterwards, she was really amazed with the fact that people were so kind to her after she came off the stage. And I said, you're at a Bigfoot conference and we're sort of like-minded people. So I thought that was just really cool, but I'm going to stop talking about that now because people want to hear what you got to say.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, I didn't get to see that part of the conference, unfortunately, because I would introduce the speakers and then I'd have to run back and handle some other duties. And so unfortunately, I missed that element of it, but I knew that was going to happen. And so I tried to sort of set the stage for that in the introduction that they asked me to do in the morning. And, one of the things that I've been writing about a lot and speaking about a lot, it has a lot to do with subjectivity and the experiential realm and how that is differentiated from objective truth, objective reality, et cetera, because we do live in this world of phenomena that manifest themselves to us. And the way that we experience those is entirely subjective. And that's because, you and I are subjects. We're not objects. And so these things occur to us and they're sort of filtered through our interpretive schemas. However, those are shaped by biology, by your culture, et cetera. And so you can have a plethora of witnesses who are describing an experience, and they can describe it as authentically as their language will allow, because language is so subjective too. I mean, if I were to say, I know you have a background in law enforcement, so if I say, yeah, I saw this vehicle, it looked like a police cruiser. Well, you picture a different vehicle than I do because I, thankfully, have never ridden in a police cruiser. But, obviously you have. And so we're using language to try to approximate something that we experience, but it's not all the same for everyone. And so, the easiest example of something like that I always bring to mind. So if people have heard me use this analogy before, I apologize. But, the archaic descriptions of the movement of the sun detail, people came up with this idea that the sun revolved around the earth. And from a experiential perspective or a phenomenological perspective, that's absolutely accurate, because when you walk outside or if you're out in the environment, the sun appears to come up one side and go up and above and around you and down the other side. So to say that the sun moves around you is a phenomenologically authentic description of the movement of the sun. However, it doesn't have a one-to-one relationship with objective reality. It took a lot of time and a lot of great minds to finally figure out that we inhabit a sphere that itself is rotating, which is rotating around the sun itself, et cetera, et cetera. And so I tried to set the stage for that to let people know that, we're going to be dealing very often in the world of experience. And people do their best, if they're being genuine and authentic and honest, to express that experience. And very often it's couched in a certain kind of language or they're using analogies or trying to describe that experience in terms that we might find fantastic or unbelievable or incredible. And just because someone's experience doesn't have, again, that one-to-one relationship with objective truth doesn't mean that they're not authentically describing that experience. And so that's always an important thing to keep in mind with witnesses or with people that describe any sort of encounter or observation of various phenomena, whether they're, categorized as fringe or taboo or not, or it's just the natural world. People still do that. I'm sure with your law enforcement background, you've experienced that with witnesses and, people who have been in certain traumatic situations, is that you might have some supportive evidence in the form of surveillance footage or, sign left at the scene, et cetera, that tells a slightly different story. But that doesn't mean that the person is lying. It's just that they're describing something through the subjective lens of how the experience felt or appeared or manifested to them in a very limited space of time. Hopefully that makes sense.
Sure. And that was one of the things that when we went through some sort of a traumatic event or some major event as police officers, we didn't give statements immediately. If you were involved in a police-involved shooting, you really didn't talk to the investigators that were going to investigate that right away. It was sometimes 2 to 3 sleep cycles later that they would then bring you in, because that's not the best time to talk to somebody who's been through a traumatic event. Because, like you said, you pull a police officer to the side, hey, what happened? Well, you can ask 5 people that were all involved what happened, and you're going to get 5 different versions of the story. And it's often dangerous, particularly in the law enforcement field, to do that to a police officer, because there may be surveillance video that maybe contradicts what the police officer says happened. And then it gives that sort of sense of, well, is this person being truthful? Are they trying to hide something? Well, no, it's just that's how they perceived what happened at the time that it happened and when they're trying to recall it. So it definitely makes a lot of sense to me. When you hear stories of people that tell, as you said, things that sound very fantastical or way out there, it may not be as out there as we initially think. Like you said, it may be something that they're trying to use their nomenclature to explain, and that may be the only way they know how to explain what happened. It's like the proverbial disappearing, cloaking Bigfoot, right? I don't believe personally that the Bigfoot can cloak and disappear. It may be something physiological. It may be the way they move. They just may be that fast. But when something's there and then it's not, people tend to use that verbiage. Hey, it just disappeared. Well, when you hear that, they go, oh, here we go. It's the woo thing, right? Well, no, they're describing something that really happened. It doesn't mean that it was like a puff of smoke and disappeared. It just means it was there and now it's not. Now I'm probably not making sense, but you know what I'm saying? It's you hear people say these stories and tell these things, and they use verbiage like, hey, it disappeared, and people think, well, you know, that can't happen, when what they really mean is it was there and now it's not.
Certainly. I mean, there's a host of animals, many analogous animals, in terms of the fact that they're rare, they're large, they're intimidating, that have sort of a mythology built up around them, or even their representations in indigenous folklore in these various parts of the world, like Africa, like Asia, etc., that have the same reputations, that are thought to be the mediators between the spiritual realm and the physical realm. And that, you know, these animals can shift between these two particular realms. And these sorts of mythologies accumulate around tigers, around bears, you know, both of which are very large and intimidating, but somewhat furtive, especially tigers. You know, they're very furtive, very stealthy animals. They're obligate carnivores and they're ambush predators. And so their entire livelihood is dependent on being undetectable. And so certainly in many of those encounters, it probably does appear to the observer that the tiger manifested out of thin air and then disappeared into nothing. There's even, you know, modern day field biologists who have done long observational field studies of tigers who describe, you know, waiting in an environment for extended lengths of time, listening for signs of the tiger, waiting for a tiger to arrive. And then all of a sudden they realize that there's one very close, you know, 30, 60 feet away. And they never saw it approach and they never heard its approach. It made its way into position stealthily and they just happened to catch a glimpse of it. And so you can just imagine that while someone's describing that experience, that is, again, it's phenomenologically authentic to describe it as such. And so I think what we have to do as investigators or people that are looking into these sorts of claims is, well, first, you take the claim and you're sort of trying to discriminate between the observation and the interpretation. Because, you know, we can make observations that get filtered through this interpretive schema, and therefore that results in sort of the general claim. You know, an analogy that I always use would be like, well, you know, I don't know much about the UFO phenomenon. I'm not a student of that, but I could easily see like, well, there's 5 of us and we see lights in the sky. And it's easy for people to say, oh, well, yeah, that's our military craft, or, oh, no, that's foreign military craft. And that means that we're under some impending doom. And no, that's celestial activity. And oh, no, that's angelic or demonic activity. Oh, no, that's extraterrestrial craft being piloted by intelligent beings. And it's like all those are interpretations. All that was really observed was the presence of lights in the sky. And so it doesn't mean, you know, even if an interpretation is outlandish, there might still be a real impetus for that, or something that was genuinely observed that results in these sort of, the consequences of which are, well, we accept something because it sounds grounded in reality, or we reject something because it sounds fantastical. Either way, it doesn't on its own validate nor nullify the initial observation. And so that's been happening in the Sasquatch phenomenon, let's say, or the pursuit of the Sasquatch subject forever. And, it leads to all these things because we're all hypothesis generating machines. I mean, that's essentially exactly what we're evolved to do, is to generate hypotheses. We have this powerful brain mechanism that, there's an older portion of the brain that generates motor output. And then there's a more highly evolved, let's say more recent part of your brain that makes abstract representations of potential motor output. So you're thinking through ways to respond to things without actually having to try those responses and fail. So we are hypothesis generating machines. And so, of course, the things that we encounter that are unknown, we generate fantasies. That's literally, the proper term for that. It's like we're creating these imaginary sort of projections as to what it might be that we're encountering. And those get sort of projected onto the phenomena as such. We sort of drape it with these fantastical projections and then treat it like that's the fact, that's the truth. Oh, it can disappear. It can paralyze you. People forget that one of the innate primate responses that's conserved across most primates, and humans are primates, is to freeze when encountered with the unknown, and especially with, a large intimidating animal. And so you see that same thing in this mythology, the pre-discovery history, let's say, of certain animals, tigers and bears, once again, or gorillas, that they had the ability to paralyze a person with their gaze. And the same thing occurs in, the sort of ape-like characters and creatures, and the way that they're represented, or the way that they're represented in indigenous folklore in North America. And so we have this propensity to put the onus on the animal. The animal can do this. It can disappear. It can paralyze you, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, no, these are all just descriptions of the failings of the human observer to track things well visually. The innate response of the human observer to freeze, what they call tonic immobility, et cetera. And so, again, they're describing a real phenomenon, but they're couching it in language that makes it easy for us to dismiss as fantasy or, mythology or something along those lines.
Yeah, and I love that you take this very scientific approach to the subject. There's a lot of people out there banging on trees and yelling and screaming, but I love the fact that you actually dug into the historical background of this, because I get that often. I tell people I'm skeptical about the subject. I'm more of a one-to-one correlation kind of guy. I've got to have evidence. And I've seen a lot of evidence, in my opinion, that these things are real and that they do, in fact, exist. However, the skeptics always have their go-tos, right? It's always, well, these things don't exist in the historical record, so they can't be real. Or, well, let's just talk about that. Let's just start there about the historical record. I had Timothy Renner on the show this past Friday from the Strange Familiars podcast, and he's sort of a historian. He goes back and finds a lot of these historical data reports in the past, 1800s, 1700s, of these things being talked about, and they do in fact exist. Can you talk a little bit about what you found as far as the historical accounts of these things being seen back in history?
Certainly. I mean, there is continuity that goes back as far as we can look, and it's difficult the further you go back in the past, because obviously there's a rich tradition among multiple indigenous peoples across North America, in now what is the United States and Canada. But those are very difficult to track down because obviously those are oral traditions. And so there's no externalized written versions until the written word begins to be employed in North America. So for that reason, we don't know exactly how old that folklore is. And I say folklore in a positive sense. A lot of people hear the word folklore and they think it's dismissive. And it's like, it's just, folklore you could look at as like the knowledge database of a social unit, whether that's a family, a group, a clan, a chiefdom, a tribe, et cetera, whatever size social group that is. And they might have what we would refer to as folklore, but it is a knowledge database. But generally speaking, it's a database of accrued experiences, observations and experiences. So it's a database that's very different than what we might consider a database today in this sort of modern scientific terms, which, modern science, science is a very new way of thinking scientifically. Science is a new process that we apply to things. And so it's not the normative human process. It's not the normative human way of interpreting the world or of thinking. And so, we have to be very charitable about that. And when we're looking at this older information and look into these knowledge databases of accrued experience. And there's an element, science functions by consensus. Obviously, things have to be repeatable. And, multiple institutions sort of congregate under the rubric of science to come to a consensus that arrives at what we agree upon as the objective reality of a given phenomenon. Well, there's an element of, let's say, oral tradition that arises by consensus too, where maybe you have a single observer who experiences something, discusses and describes that within a social unit. And the discussion of that typically will have to do with the realm of action, how to act in the presence of this phenomena or how to avoid it, et cetera. Because again, it's not an investigation into the material reality of it the way science is. It's more of, the world is a place to act. There's an environment and its inhabitants, living inhabitants, including humans, and how should you behave in these things. So it's really like a moral landscape, an ethical landscape, one that's rooted in, perpetuating and surviving. And so those things get discussed and described, and they're codified into stories and in narratives, because narratives, we're wired for narrative. That's why they're so easy to remember. It's much easier to remember a story than it is some long, bullet list of facts, right? So I think there's something like you're 75% more likely to remember information when it is encoded into a narrative form rather than just being presented with it, again, as bullet points and trying to carry that on. And so these things arise via consensus and discussion, are codified into stories, and then are passed down across multiple generations that undoubtedly get refined over and over and over again, and then added to as more observations that are relevant to that are accrued. So I look at something like folklore as a very powerful database that has a tremendous amount of reliable information in it, but a lot of which is in that realm of phenomenological information, subjective, experiential information, et cetera. So there is this long history that goes back. We don't know exactly how long that is, but certainly once the written word is employed, you begin to see references to people describing encountering this sort of thing. The description of an upright, hair-covered animal, anywhere from, let's say, 7 to 8 feet tall at the sort of maximum heights, or the larger examples, that is devoid of a tail, is devoid of claws, doesn't have a muzzle, doesn't have obvious pointed ears. And so you can look at the consistencies across these reports, and you can start making some eliminations. Well, if these represent an animal, which is a big if, because again, we as a society or as humanity, we don't know that these things exist. People have made personal discoveries, or let's say people have claimed personal discovery on an individual basis. But, just for the sake of intellectual honesty, let's just say if these claims represent an animal, well, then you make these certain eliminations based on the commonalities, and what you arrive at is something that approximates an ape, right? It's not a bear or a canid or an 8-foot tall squirrel based on these consistencies. And so the history of claims of observations of animals fitting the description of what we would call a Sasquatch do go back as far back as you can look in the written word. And of course, they're housed under a lot of different descriptors, of nomenclature, because Bigfoot wasn't coined until 1958, and Sasquatch wasn't coined. That's an anglicized version of a First Nations word. That's not coined until 1929. So prior to that, there's not a single descriptor, a single catch-all for all of these things. So I think there's actually a tremendous amount more of these sorts of accounts that have yet to be mined from their repositories, because now that things are getting digitized, it's easier to search newspaper archives and old things that have been put into books, and now books are being digitized, et cetera. But you have to know what to search for, right? So there's this plethora of terms that, run the gamut. Even odd things like, beastie or the nondescript. There's one report that comes to mind where the gentleman saw the nondescript on such and such mountain. And of course, it goes on to describe what is consistent with what we would call a Sasquatch, et cetera. So I think there's probably even more reports than we're currently aware of out there. But there's also a lot of print media hoaxes, too, and that's totally worth pointing out. It's funny because I'm working on this book project, so I'm right in the middle of a chapter about the historical record. And there was this one highly detailed sighting that was printed in an Ohio newspaper that was describing an event that occurred in Pennsylvania. And there's a tremendous amount of detail in what this person claimed to observe, and it's very compelling. It sounds like they observed a large ape. And it's right around the cusp in this sort of like mid-1800s era where, first the mountain gorilla is discovered, and then later the explorer Paul de Chaillu, who he dispatched living gorillas and brought their specimens back to Europe. And he wrote about his expeditions. His book was published in 1861, and then that became sort of the first popular literature that described living gorillas. And so there were some of these references in this Wild Man report that I thought, wow, I wonder where this falls in that really tight timeline of our understanding of gorillas. And so I was searching for the first references to chest beating, because in this report it mentioned the thing was beating its chest. And sure enough, because I have de Chaillu's book, I believe I don't have it in front of me. I think it's called Explorations of Equatorial Africa, something along those lines. And so I pulled it up and I'm searching through it. And lo and behold, I found this passage where he's describing a lone male gorilla that he collected. And it is verbatim this story that was published in this Ohio newspaper, albeit 12 years prior. And so it's like, oh, well, first of all, I can let myself off the hook for being kind of sucked into that story because it really was a detailed observation of a large ape. It just happened to be plagiarized from Paul de Chaillu. And so there's no doubt that when we're looking at these historical stories, that one in particular, that there were print media hoaxes, that, the popularity of, let's say, that particular gorilla literature might have inspired some journalist on a slow day to say, oh, well, I'm just going to steal some lines from this book and pretend that this is what someone described seeing in rural Pennsylvania in, 1873. So we have to do a lot of, once again, like discriminating and trying to separate the wheat from the chaff in terms of those historical reports, if we were trying to get down to the bottom of what's generating them, whether that's observations of a real animal or whether that's entirely the production of the human mind. Either way, it's definitely demonstrable that people have been claiming to see this kind of animal for as far back in time as you can look in the written word. And then, of course, there's older examples in these externalized artistic depictions that were generated by indigenous peoples, whether that's depictions on totem poles, the carved stone heads of the Columbia River, the Tsimshian monkey mask from British Columbia. There are these ape-like creatures represented in art that can be dated. But certainly the history is there. It does not start with Bigfoot in 1958. It doesn't start with William Rowe. It doesn't start with Ape Canyon. It's much, much, much older than all of that.
I hear these stories all the time, and that's one of the things you can see, fast forward to present day, people are seeing these things all over the country. There are accounts literally across the continent and around the world that are very consistent with what people are seeing. And, that's always been my argument. I am skeptical, but I do believe these things exist. And that's one of the things that I love about doing this show is because people don't write down their encounters. Even in the historical accounts, the ones that you're able to find were where they were reported and a newspaper reporter or something wrote them down. People don't write down what happens to them. We're not a diary society anymore. Everything's digitized, and you pass it on and tell the story orally to your friends, family, whatever. Very few people write it down, and I think that's why, frankly, shows like this are important, at least in my mind, to document some of those encounters, because I'm taking an encounter and I'm putting it into an audio form that we can go back 100 years from now or whatever, 1,000 years from now, if somebody finds this podcast and says, hey, look what they were talking about back then. That's crazy. They didn't think Sasquatch existed and they thought all these people were crazy, right? But the historical accounts to me are very important because before people even knew what gorillas were or had any firsthand knowledge of ape behavior, you can read some of these accounts and they're talking about very specific things that are very ape-like. So that said, where do you come down on the subject, Matt? Are you convinced that these things are real? And I know you're into paleoanthropology, and I certainly want to get into, do you think these things are real? And if so, what do you think they are, and what are you convinced that they aren't?
Certainly. That's a lot of questions. So let's unpack them all. I mean, to me, and this is sort of the crux of the book project that I'm writing, it should be sort of seen as an uncontested fact that the phenomenon itself exists. You have this, well, let's just call it the Sasquatch phenomenon. And it's It's composed of these two primary bodies, let's say. One is the body of testimonial claims of observation, encounter, etc. And one is the body of, let's say, items or objects or elements, physical elements that are attributed to the phenomenon itself, whether we're talking about physical traces like footprints or the documented representations of those as tracks, or, we have things like hair, fibers, etc., that are collected that seem to defy categorization, but that have shared consistencies with each other, that seem to have affinities with primates, etc. All of these things exist. We've sort of aggregated them and collected them under this Sasquatch rubric. And so the phenomenon itself exists. Now, the question is, what generates it? Well, the more you look into this, anything is endless, the more you look into it. And that's true of anything you could possibly think of, that if you had the sufficient curiosity and the time and willpower, it really is endless to dig and to dig and to dig. So something as complex as this phenomenon that comprises, again, so many witnesses and so many bits of evidence with so many various interpretations of that evidence, there can't be a single explanatory mechanism that solves the whole thing. It's not all real, let's say, and it's not all fabricated, because there are people that have misidentifications that they're authentically telling you their misidentification, right? I mean, they saw something, 250 yards away at dusk, and it was dark colored moving through the brush. Well, that's probably an authentic description. Now, was it a Sasquatch? Probably not, statistically speaking, should such animals exist. So you take this and you boil it down to what generates it at the very root of it, the core of it. And what you really have are two options. There either is some biological species of animal fitting the description of these claimants, in fitting, that has feet that are shaped like these footprints attributed to them, or in lieu of such a species, it's all the production of the human mind. And there's a few forms that can take. It can be an involuntary production, something akin to like Carl Jung's concept of the archetypes, some element of this basal conserved consciousness that's conserved across our entire species, or it's the voluntary product of the human mind, being, people generate fictional stories, which we absolutely know that they do. And so what's likely is all of those things are occurring simultaneously to generate the whole thing overall. But one of those two things is at the bottom of it. And so if you took the bedrock of the phenomenon, let's say the most credible sightings, ones where there's no room for misinterpretation, where you have witnesses who are of otherwise unimpeachable character, who are reliable, who have, in every other element of their life, they're considered trustworthy, and they describe seeing something from head to toe in favorable lighting conditions that approximates this large ape form. Well, they're either telling the truth or they're not. You couldn't reasonably misidentify a moose as an 8-foot tall ape, with long arms, disproportionately long arms, broad shoulders, no neck, a peaked head, heavy brow ridge, a flat face, et cetera, et cetera. So either there's some animal that people are seeing or they're making up. And the same goes for the very best evidence. And let's just, for the sake of this discussion, throw out everything but the tracks, because, we don't know what's depositing these hairs. The hairs exist. They are consistent with each other. That's its own mystery that might be connected to this mystery, probably is connected to this mystery, but the tracks are the same thing. The best examples of the best footprints, there's several that come to mind. I'm looking at one of the Grays Harbor County tracks from the 1982 incident in front of me. That's either been left by an animal with a foot that is shaped like that, or it was fabricated by a human, because it's certainly not registered bear tracks, and it's certainly not elk tracks, and it's certainly not a human track, because it's markedly different, and the size would rule out, a human having left those. So again, you're left with one of these two choices. There's no intermediary between those two. Well, maybe the apes are like half real and people half imagine it. No, that's not possible. And so what it boils down to for me, and this is such a difficult proposition because I've never seen one. I've never observed one of these things. I've had experiences that were consistent with the phenomenon, but, I cannot say like, oh yeah, I've seen one, and have that sort of confidence that many of my peers who I trust do. And so for me, if I have to defend the pursuit or the proposition, it would be, well, the more that you understand the complexity in as high a resolution perspective as you possibly can, and you're always weighing it between these two options. Number one, that there's a biological ape species that's very rare, with a small population that's widely distributed in certain areas of viable habitat, or it's all the production of the human mind. I find that the proposition that an ape species is responsible for is the simpler of the two. It's the more parsimonious of the two. It requires less assumptions, less leaps of logic, less scaffolding to build from like a bottom-up sort of perspective on the subject to suffice. And so based on that, you think, okay, well, where do we go from here if there is such an ape species? And part of the way I view it, too, is, there's the axiom or the adage that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And so from one perspective, yeah, this is an extraordinary claim, right? That there's some large upright ape species in North America that's responsible for the mythos of the Sasquatch or the Sasquatch phenomenon, or at least a substantial portion of it. But really, if you look at it from like this bird's eye view of time and space, and you're like, well, all I'm really proposing, we know that apes exist. I'm just proposing one additional ape. And if these are members of the giant ape line that produced Indopithecus and Gigantopithecus, then I'm not even proposing an additional ape to the fossil record. We already have these two genera represented, and it might be a descendant of one of those two, or another species that we haven't found the fossils of yet that came out of one of those two genera, or it could be some other genus that was part of that clade that we're not aware of yet. Could it have gotten to North America? Well, an array of mammals have made it over here, including many of the contemporaries of Gigantopithecus. So I think when you couch it in those terms, it's like it's not that extraordinary of a claim, so long as it's grounded in this biological explanation, this ecological explanation of time and space, that these giant apes existed in Asia, and I'd love to talk more about those, that could have come over here, that were contemporaneous with our genus Homo for over 1 million years. So we did live alongside giant apes in Asia for a very long time, or at least our ancestors did. They were likely sympatric with early Homo sapiens in Asia. So I think that the biological ape species is the simpler of the two provisional hypotheses, and I don't think it's that extraordinary of a claim to investigate. Now, you can't make that as a de facto claim like, oh, well, based on everything we have so far, we know these things exist and we can prove it. That's an erroneous claim. But as a proposition, I don't think it's extraordinary. And I view it as a problem that's still yet to be solved, because no matter how long we've all been engaged in this, which hasn't really been that long. I mean, Sasquatch research as such is only about 60 years old. It's only really since like the very late 1950s, generally speaking. And so we've been engaged in this, and yet there's this disparity between institutions, governmental, academic, scientific institutions that say, well, they don't exist, et cetera. And then you have individuals, whether that's proponents who are academics or scientists, of which there are many, or the individuals who claim contact with this phenomenon in reality, witnesses or proponents, researchers, people who pursue it, et cetera. And so there's always going to be this divide. It's not going away. Every time there's a hoax, of which there have been a great many, and sort of the world breathes a sigh of relief and says, oh, yeah, you see, there really is nothing to this. It is all just a hoax. Sightings continue to pour in. People continue to pursue this. And so an answer is needed, an answer that's satisfactory to both sides of that divide where there's an agreed upon thing. And so I do think that pursuit is necessary. I think the pursuit of a biological hypothesis is absolutely crucial and cannot be summarily or easily dismissed. It shouldn't be dismissed. No one could responsibly engage all this information and easily dismiss it. It's easy to dismiss when there's a lack of intense familiarity or intimate familiarity with it. But so, that's sort of where I stand. I am convinced that they're real. And that makes it a very difficult proposition for people, because they think, well, you've already made up your mind. And I know I could be wrong about this. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that, but that, I've made up my mind. But I am convinced, I've definitely gone from being a hardcore true believer of the most like zealous kind to being so sort of embittered by what I perceived as like defeats or failures, or the inability to resolve the question for myself, that I became vitriolically cynical and just, thought, oh, it's all a big waste of time. And I was lying to myself all along. And to finally find myself somewhere that's a lot more centered, having inhabited both of those extremes and realizing like, well, there's not a lot of truth in the extremes, right? The truth is somewhere in that middle, and that I do think it's worth pursuing. I do think it's worth defending the proposition that the biological reality is the simpler of the two. But the onus is on us who feel that way to demonstrate that. You know, the onus is not on the skeptics to come to us. The onus is on us. And so I have a perfect understanding and clarity of why skeptics treat the subject the way that they do, and also because this subject has continued to accumulate more and more and more outlandish claims, ridiculous claims, bad behavior, hoaxes. And so it's no wonder, you know, that skeptics or even people who are fence sitters stay at, you know, multiple arm's lengths away from this thing. I have no illusions about that, you know, people should just take my word for it and listen to my position, you know, but we are entitled to our positions, and that's what mine is, and that's essentially what it's predicated upon.
Yeah, I often get accused of, you know, just drinking the Kool-Aid and saying, hey, you know, you believe this, so you're not going to listen to anybody else. That's not true at all. I am very skeptical, and I, like you, have went back and forth many times from being 100% totally convinced that these things are real to, you know, you get bogged down in the minutia of, I listen to a lot of encounter stories, and I listen to a lot of things that seem very outlandish, and, you know, I get a lot of pictures and videos and emails day after day after day. And I think that's one of the things that has caused me personally to go back and forth on the subject, because very credible witnesses that have been on my show that the listeners have heard have sent me some great evidence, video evidence, you know, trail cam videos and foot castings and things like that I've seen. But those same people also, it's almost like everything becomes Bigfoot, and there's a lot of pareidolia. I get these pictures of nothing, and it's, hey, look at this juvenile, or hey, look at this female holding a baby, and I'm like, that's a bunch of trees. That's it. It's just leaves and trees. And so that in of itself has really caused me to question, because I'm like, well, if this is happening and they think that everything is Bigfoot, well, what about the story that they told me? You know, and then I start second guessing myself. And luckily I have great people around me that say, look, you know, it's not up to you to decide who's telling the truth, or if everything that makes it on your show is absolutely 100% the real deal. You're a conduit for the people to make up their mind. But I spend a lot of time in skeptic groups on Facebook. I'm in the Stephen Strufert's group, the Coalition for Critical Thinking and Bigfoot Research. Those guys are ruthless in that group. And we go back and forth on a lot of things, but I think it's very important that I spend time in there and I get that perspective, because I want to be that person finding the truth somewhere in the middle. It's like you said, that's a very poignant point. The truth is not in the extremes. It's somewhere in the middle. And
Certainly.
I like to surround myself with people that are way more skeptical than me to sort of keep me grounded in that. So that said, and the brilliant answer that you gave as far as where you come down on whether these things exist or not, let's get into, you mentioned you wanted to talk some about these Asian apes that we've coexisted with in the past. Why don't you go into some of that and talk a little bit about what you think these things could be and what you think they're not?
Oh, absolutely. I'd love to touch on a point you just made, if I could just backtrack it for 1 second, if you're cool with that. Absolutely. I do think that there's, you know, because I think a lot of people bring things to groups of skeptics. And I know the Coalition is a pretty diverse group of people, so I wouldn't even like try to categorize that as like all skeptics or all cynics or anything of that nature. There's people with all sorts of different viewpoints, and maybe people that are consider themselves to be witnesses or have seen them on and on, people that are skeptical, people that are cynical. I mean, it runs the gamut, right? But everything that we do, we sort of operate within these shared value structures. And I see so many people run to groups like that, or even, you know, any sort of people that they consider to be on, whether you want to call it an opposing team or people who inhabit an opposing viewpoint, whatever. And they think that, you know, they found something that they put at the top of their own value structure, their own hierarchy of values, right? And maybe that is an experience. Maybe that is, two trees that are leaned over in such a way that from a certain angle, it looks like an X. And so they interpret that as like some representative of like symbolic thinking, and it had to have been manipulated by hands. And so to them, it has all this value, but they're carrying it into somewhere that, for the rest of the world, that's not part of their value structure, And so you have to kind of understand like the game that you're playing and play the same game. You can't walk onto a baseball field dribbling a basketball and say, oh, actually, I just scored a point. You lose, I win. Because they'll say, nope, that's not the game we're playing. You're in the wrong place. And so if we're talking about science, well, there's a value structure there that's predicated on, again, like objective material reality, taking an observable phenomenon, stripping away the subjective from it to get to the root of that objective truth. And so the things that would facilitate that are like irrefutable bits of physical evidence, and trace evidence doesn't always fit that bill. And so tracks have yet to constitute any sort of proof in a scientific sense, although it is, if these animals are real, tracks then probably represent some sort of trace evidence, right? But you couldn't take a plaster cast to a Department of Anthropology and say, here's proof of the North American ape or North American relic hominoid. Go ahead and list this thing. You're welcome. You'll get laughed out of there. And because you're not playing within their value structure. And you can think about that, a million different ways in your own life. Like, think of something that you're intensely interested in that's outside of the Bigfoot thing, even something from pop culture, because we all occupy these little niches, right? These little specialized silos of our own interests. We're all nerds in some way, right? So, it might be some TV show or some movie or some band that you love, and maybe you'd be willing to pay like $1,000 for the guitar pick of this guitar player, and to anyone else it's just a useless piece of plastic that isn't worth any more than any other 10-cent guitar pick, right? But it's because where you place the importance of this cultural thing, this cultural phenomenon in your own life, you've put it at the top of this value hierarchy, and therefore you're willing to sacrifice for that because you work, ergo you're trading your time for money. And so you accumulate that money and you're willing to toss it at, a guitar pick of your favorite guitar player that maybe other people don't care about. And so I think very often in this field, and I'm not trying to pick on Bigfoot researchers because we all do this in other parts of our lives, is that we congregate in groups where we erect our own value structures that we agree upon. Again, like if you're a stamp collector or a comic book collector or, a huge nerd of like whatever band or whatever movie character, TV show, etc., you and all the people that share that structure can negotiate and agree upon value. But you couldn't take that in, if you were a stamp collector, you couldn't take that to, the general public and say, hey, does anyone want to buy this for $10,000? They're going to say, no, that's a useless piece of paper that I don't differentiate from any other small useless piece of paper other than like a 25-cent stamp. So it's a losing game for people to continue playing blob squatches and stick structures that might have value within their own peer groups. But, I don't want to say I'm not sympathetic, but to a certain degree, like you've got to define your expectations. And if you expect that you could take photographs of things of that subjective nature into a discussion where it's the presupposition, or the group is predicated on a skeptical stance on something for which there is yet no physical proof, and yet offer that up as supportive physical proof or evidence with the expectation that you're going to receive positive feedback, I think that's just an unrealistic thing. And so we have to be very clear about our values. And there's nothing wrong with saying, well, this is valuable to me. If I had an experience, if I heard a vocalization, if I found an impression in the ground that I thought I could reasonably rule out other causes or sources that to me, I'm like, well, maybe this is the track of a Sasquatch. There's nothing wrong with me holding that in my own value structure. But it would be entirely unrealistic for me to think that I can impose that onto other people and that they would see the same value of it or the same value in it. It's entirely unrealistic. And so if we want to play by the rules of science, which so many people engaged in this proclaim that they want to do, they profess a desire to have this recognized or studied or validated by these institutions, and yet are unwilling to play by the rules of the institutions. And so it's just, that's a recipe for disappointment and perceived failure. And I've been there. We've all been there. I mean, believe me, like I'm describing my own journey in this too. I'm not just castigating other people because I've been through it too, you know, but that is the nature of the game, unfortunately. And so people have got to understand like what value structure they want to occupy and what constitutes valuable evidence within that structure, and then abide by it. And so, you know, I've got like pounds of casting material that I've had in my bin, you know, that I take camping with associated field research or field investigation oriented gear that has been in there since like 2005 or 2006. You know, I haven't felt compelled to cast anything that I've seen in the field because I'm familiar with what constitutes the most detailed tracks thus far, knowing full well that they have not constituted proof, right? And so it would be unrealistic of me to expect that I could cast something of lesser resolution or detail or clarity, and that it would have any other value than being a paperweight on my own desk, or maybe a conversation starter among friends, right? And so I don't have this sort of backlog of evidence that I've accumulated from the field or photographs or things of that nature, because I know that the things that I have encountered that were suggestive or compelling to me wouldn't have the value within that structure for the institutions that I would hope would be validating such things were they to be collected by myself. So I think people would save themselves a lot of heartache by clearly defining their expectations and then abiding by those once they've been clearly defined. That's what I had to do in order to you know, save myself a lot of heartache and headache.
Very good point. And I will go back and say this, or every time I've had issues with somebody in the coalition group, it was brought on by me, typically being a little bit of an ass. So for all the listeners out there in the coalition group, let me clarify my statements earlier. I said those guys, some of the guys in the group are ruthless. I always get into it with those guys. Every time I put out a show and I mention the group and I say all as an inclusive group, that is not what I'm saying. Just some of you guys, and you know who you are, and I love you for it. But they do listen to the show, and they will be emailing me. So I wanted to throw that caveat in there. So that said, let's get back to the paleoanthropology part of this. I think that's where we were heading when we got on that tangent about the coalition group. And I certainly appreciate that because I think the points that you made about that are very valid. But let's talk about paleoanthropology part of this. And let's talk about some of the candidates that you think are good candidates for these things, should they exist, and some that you sort of ruled out in your own mind that are probably not good candidates for these things.
Certainly. So, you know, again, going back to the proposition, the Sasquatch phenomenon exists. One of two things is at the very bottom of it. It's either a biological species of animal or it's a production of the human mind. Well, if we're going to explore the biological species hypothesis or that hypothetical model, you've got to couch that in the knowns. You can't say, well, it could be an animal that we just have no record for whatsoever at all. Well, that's not a very strong hypothesis. And it could be, right? Because we've discovered such an infinitesimally small number of the things that ever walk this earth, because fossilization is such a rare occurrence and such a rare process that happens in such a small portion of the planet to such a small portion of the animals that occupy those small portions of the planet, on and on and on. So you have to ground that in the known. Otherwise, you know, if the old idea that it can't exist, therefore it doesn't exist. Well, if someone believes that, then if I even explore the biological proposition, well, they think, well, you're trying to explore the impossible. And so I think this Asian ape line shows that it is possible, plausible, you know, those things can be debated. But we do know that there was a line of these very, very large apes that existed in Asia. That, you know, their history is sort of complicated because there's been different taxonomic designations that have changed over the years. But using the current nomenclature, essentially you have this older genus, which is now called Indopithecus, that was formerly thought to be Gigantopithecus. And that's, you know, those fossils are very scant. So there was a tooth that was recovered from the Patwar Plateau of Pakistan by Guy Pilgrim in 1915. And then there's a mandible from the Siwalik Hills of India. And I forget what year that was actually unearthed, but then it was buried in a fence line to hide the thing. It was considered to be the jaw of one of the devils, you know, like very similar to how we have, you know, there's nomenclature about Sasquatches referring to them as devils, and the same thing with other mystery apes around the world. that's neither here nor there. So this oldest form, those fossils are roughly like 8.6 million years old. They were about the size of modern gorillas. So pretty big, right? And again, that's Western Asia. So Pakistan, India, and then there's this younger form, which is roughly, the oldest examples are roughly 2 million years old. It's called Gigantopithecus blacki, Gigantopithecus meaning giant ape in Latin. They're, as far as we know, the largest apes that ever lived. And those occur all over Southeast Asia. And that's another tricky one to track down because a lot of the various papers and publications in journals describing these things are not always exact with all of the, like, there's so many teeth. We don't know the origins of all the teeth because a lot of those were recovered from Chinese apothecaries. You know, there's a number of jaws or mandibles. And then there's this really interesting paper about a mandible that was recovered in 2014, if I'm not mistaken, from a place called Semedo on the island of Java that's thought to be a Gigantopithecus. So this is a huge range. So we know that there are fossils from Vietnam, from various parts of South and Central China, potentially from Java, the area of like Thailand, Laos, etc. So this very large distribution of Asia that had these apes. Then you have this gap in time because it's uncontested that Gigantopithecus emerged from Indopithecus, that they're connected in this lineage. And so you have these Indopithecus fossils roughly 8.6 million years old, and then this 6 million year gap where none of these apes are represented, and then Gigantopithecus roughly 2 million years old until about 300,000 years ago is sort of roughly the age of the youngest fossils. But obviously that wouldn't have been the very last one. So it's thought that they probably lived until about between 100 and 200,000 years ago, fairly recently, geologically speaking. Gigantopithecus is much larger than Indopithecus. You know, there's various size ranges that are estimated, but again, all we really have are mandibles and teeth, but they do represent what seems to be the largest ape that ever existed. Interestingly, they're contemporaneous with Homo erectus for over 1 million years, with fossils co-occurring in the same sites. So we do know that, you know, this line of large apes existed rather. That, you know, there was a recent study it's like a comparative protein analysis, which is called proteomics. It's considered to be like in lieu of being able to extract and sequence DNA, these protein comparisons are like a low resolution proxy for DNA. So now we know, based on this 2019 study, that Gigantopithecus, the closest living relative to that ape, is the orangutan, and that they would have diverged from a common ancestor roughly 10 to 12 million years ago. So a very, very long time ago. And you'll see very often in these depictions of Gigantopithecus, they always portray it like a giant orangutan, which I think is sort of lazy, because having diverged from a common ancestor 10 to 12 million years ago would hardly produce just a big version of its close relative, right? I mean, think about our divergence from chimpanzees between 6 and 7 million years ago. Now, we're kind of a rare exception because we're pretty strange creatures, but obviously you wouldn't say that chimpanzees are just little humans or that humans are just big chimpanzees. I mean, there's a lot of difference there. And then the divergence between chimpanzees and gorillas from a common ancestor, and on and on and on. So I don't think Gigantopithecines would have just essentially been just big orangutans, although they did share a common ancestor. So we know that apes like this existed, or let's say very, very large apes coexisted with humans for 1 million years. And we don't know what sort of pressure those two genera had on each other, Gigantopithecus and Homo. It's been posited that they would have competed for resources. There would have been conflict because they're both hominoids, and they would have had probably similar diet preferences. Gigantopithecus had a very wide-ranging generalist diet. It was formerly thought that they were bamboo specialists, and that's been thoroughly dispelled. I hear people bring that up very often. They only ate bamboo. That's just a very old notion that's been dispelled. We know that they had a very diverse diet of plant foods. So they would have competed undoubtedly with Homo erectus in the place that they co-occurred. And there's also this pervasive question that, well, did Homo erectus hunt and eat Gigantopithecus? And there's several thinkers who posit that. I mean, there's one of the most detailed and recent papers on Gigantopithecus is by two scientists, Zhang and Harrison, who postulate in there that, given its size and its terrestrial habits, they would have been ground dwelling. Gigantopithecus probably would have been a pretty easy prey item for Homo erectus. And then Russell Shahan, an anthropologist who wrote extensively, he was sort of the primary anthropologist studying Gigantopithecus, and he wrote a book called Other Origins about his expeditions to Asia to recover fossils and sort of their findings and suppositions about Gigantopithecine. Said, something along, I'm paraphrasing, but I'll try to get the exact quote, but something like, we must be prepared to accept the possibility that Homo erectus engaged in the wholesale slaughter of Gigantopithecus down to the very last individual, which is a pretty intense thing to say. Shahan's a pretty conservative thinker, scientifically speaking, and so that might sound like a hyperbolic statement, but the fact that he's positing it, say, well, if these apes are extinct, which most scientists think that they are, say, well, why were they driven extinct during this time? Would it have been climate change that was changing, the landscape where they were able to get food resources? Because we know that Gigantopithecus was restricted to dense forests, closed canopy forests with dense understories, and so as those landscapes changed into grasslands, it would have been detrimental to them. Or perhaps they were hunted by our ancestors. Either way, it would have put some pressure on these things. And so the hypothesis that I think has the most grounding or footing, or the highest possibility of being true if these apes exist, again, back to my model of a biological ape species at the core of the Sasquatch phenomenon, would be that, okay, well, we know that these large apes existed and they coexisted with our ancestors. Our ancestors probably put pressure on them in one of two ways, or maybe both, from competition for resources to hunting them, because many human ancestors hunted a lot of bigger, scarier things than big apes. So that's not a ridiculous proposition at all whatsoever. So if they were to survive that pressure, what would that look like? Well, very often animals that get into conflict with humans, and these were near humans, right? Homo erectus, they're our ancestors, will adopt a host of strategies and adaptations like temporal niche partitioning. They'll become more active at times when confrontations are less likely, like, let's say, being more active at night. They'll start to prefer more inaccessible habitat, more rugged terrain, denser forests, etc. Very often they'll change their repertoire when there's food scarcity. Orangutans, for example, have been documented hunting and scavenging. Now, we think of orangutans as fruit eaters, but they've been documented hunting and killing and eating slow lorises, scavenging carcasses. That I believe one included a infant gibbon, so which is another primate, because a slow loris is also a primate. And so you think that they would have had access to these other food resources during this food scarcity in the orangutan realm. And if the orangutan and Gigantopithecus shared a common ancestor, then it's not unreasonable for me to think that potentially they exploited prey animals when available. Long story short, that our ancestors were this sort of like evolutionary pressure cooker that created an animal that was over, again, 1 million years of co-occurrence, which is a very long time, selected for avoidance of human detection, temporal niche partitioning, which would probably naturally lead it to become more of an opportunistic predator at times, or scavenger, or both, thus producing the Sasquatch. It's very similar to what you see in this set of the consistencies across the testimonial claims, that canon of data that people see this large, upright, hair-covered ape that's active at periods during the day and night, seems to be fairly active at night, that is occasionally seen ambushing predators, etc., or is occasionally seen acting as an ambush predator, ambushing prey. This model sort of posits the possibility of that. And then the other unresolved question is like, well, how do they get here? Knowing that many of the contemporaries of Gigantopithecus did make it over here. There's a lot of Asian mammals that made it into North America via Beringia. The black bear is genetically related to the Asiatic black bear, or I guess the sun bear or sloth bear, both. Proboscideans, mammoths, mastodons, felids came across Beringia, and then most importantly, Homo sapiens. So there's your bipedal ape that walks through connected, viable habitat from one landmass to another during these periods of where that sort of transmission is possible. So for me, if you take the Sasquatch as a question, you make the proposition that a biological species is one of two options, and you're investigating that one option to say, well, is this possible? You can take Gigantopithecus, even at like the simplest version of it, devoid of all those adaptations that I just hypothesized, and say, okay, well, we know these large apes coexisted with our ancestors, so I only need to make two assumptions to solve for that. Did they make it into North America? Are there still any around? And either of those, let's say they did make it into North America, but there are not any still around. Well, that could still be the genesis of the indigenous representations. Or maybe they clung on until, the 1800s. And so some of those stories are representative of actual observations, but I don't think that's the case. I think if they did make it over here, that's what people are seeing today. But in terms of everything we could look at in the fossil record, I mean, some people have posited things like Paranthropus, for example. Well, Paranthropus is a lot harder to solve for because, for all intents and purposes, they probably looked like little Sasquatches. They were bipedal. They had disproportionately long arms. They had a sagittal crest, but they were very small. They're like somewhere between 3 and 4 feet tall. These things occurred in Eastern Africa and Southern Africa very long time ago. And the fossil ages, as you get to the younger fossils, the newer ones, they have a southerly trend towards South Africa. Seems to be where or Southern Africa seems to be where the last survivors of the Paranthropines were. So they're not moving northerly, let's say, towards the Levant and then into Eurasia. They're clinging on southerly. During that time frame that they're represented, which I believe is about 2 million years, they don't change in size. They're not getting larger. So if you wanted to posit Paranthropus as a hominid candidate for the Sasquatch, you would have to, basically triple it in size and in mass. In height, you maybe double it, but in mass, you have to triple it or so. You have to get it through the Mediterranean Levant, across Eurasia, Asia, up through Siberia, across Beringia and into North America. And you have to do this. And I believe the oldest, I could be wrong about this, I believe the youngest fossils rather of Paranthropus are like 500,000 years old. So we know they were still in Africa and they were still that size then. So in 500,000 years, you have to accomplish all these things. Well, again, you're stacking up assumptions to make that fit. There are other candidates, like there's an ape genus called Meganthropus that is from Java. It's only from one site. I think it's called I'm going to mispronounce it, so I won't even try, but it's in Java. It was so man-like that it was thought for a long time that it represented large individuals of Homo erectus. But a study not too long ago that did a comparative tooth morphology analysis found that no, Meganthropus is a distinct taxon. It is a non-human ape. And so we know that there was, at least during this time in Asia, one other very man-like ape that was very large, literally Meganthropus, large man, even though, again, now we understand that it's a non-human ape. The estimates for those things were like 7 to 8 feet tall. We just don't know. There's not enough remains, much like Gigantopithecus. But they were also contemporaneous with Gigantopithecus. So those Asian apes make sort of the best model, whether you're picking one of the known ones or, if you wanted to elaborate or develop that hypothesis, I would posit, okay, well, we know this clade existed that produced these giant apes. Well, a clade will produce multiple genera. We only know of 2, Indopithecus and Gigantopithecus. A genus will produce multiple species, a radiation of species. Per each genera, we only know of 1 species, Indopithecus giganteus and Gigantopithecus blacki. So they would have produced other forms of large ape. Maybe some of those forms were more or less Sasquatch-like and occurred in areas that were closer to Beringia in Asia, in more northerly montane forests, etc. But that all being said, I think that model serves to show that it is possible that a biological species could give rise to the Sasquatch phenomenon. That's a real possibility, and that Asian ape line serves as the model for that. I think every other candidate that you could posit it falls short figuratively and literally if you're talking about Paranthropus, but also it requires so many assumptions. And to me, Gigantopithecus just requires 2. Like, did they get into North America? Are there any still around?
I think those are very good points. And the ultimate question comes down to proof, right? We don't have that specimen. And that sort of leads me into, before we wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about that. I want to talk about the North American Wood Ape Conservancy and what they're doing. I know you're a member, and what you guys are doing and what I won't say the sole purpose for the existence of the Conservancy, but one of the main goals is to collect a specimen, harvest a specimen so that we can figure out what these things are. So I want to sort of go into that. But before we get to the harvesting of a specimen, I want you to just briefly, if you would, I know your time is valuable and I want to be respectful of that, but let's just talk about one of the many things that I get often. If you could just address what's the likelihood of us? Everybody always says, well, where's the body? Where's the bones, right? Why haven't we found a specimen dead in the woods? Can you talk to that just a little bit and maybe explain why that's a little bit harder than people might think?
Certainly. Well, I think, if these animals do exist, again, if the proposition A is true, that there is a biological species at the core of the Sasquatch phenomenon, then we have to look again across that entire set of data that includes the testimonial claims, that includes, what's currently offered as evidence, let's say, primarily tracks and other things, vocalization recordings, et cetera, and try to extrapolate some or generate some responsible hypotheses from those. So if that data set really does represent observations and encounters with real apes, then it's clear that what we're dealing with are very, very, very rare animals, right? I mean, they occur in certain areas across North America. This idea that they're spread across the whole continent everywhere, I think, is erroneous. And we could get into that too, but there's the most reliable reports come from viable habitat that also supports large omnivorous mammals like black bears or brown bears, or other large mammals, even obligate carnivores like mountain lions, although they have a much more diverse array of habitats that they can occupy. They're certainly not restricted to forests like Sasquatches seem to be, or that these claims would indicate, if such claims do represent objective reality. So you would expect that, a very large animal would require a large range to sustain itself. Apes tend to live long lives, and larger animals tend to live longer lives. And so it's not unrealistic to hypothesize that if there is an ape species responsible for the phenomenon, that what it is a very wide-ranging ape that occupies an extremely large home range that lives a very long life. And so animals that fit that description, if you were to look at a given area, let's say if you could posit the home range of one of these things, and let's just be really, it's funny to say liberal or conservative, like a liberal estimate for a Sasquatch home range would be like 50 to 70 square miles. And I say that's liberal because the smaller the home range, the more of those home ranges I can fit into an area, right? So like the Southern Appalachians is, there's a significant portion of it that's like roughly 135,000 square miles that constitutes temperate rainforest because of the amount of rainfall it receives and the sort of, life that it produces, the biodiversity, et cetera. It's a temperate forest zone. 135,000 square miles is huge. So if I'm saying, oh, well, let's say that they have a home range of 70 square miles. Well, I could fit a lot of Sasquatches into that, right? I mean, that seems like people would be tripping over them at that point. So it's probably something larger than that. But for the sake of this discussion, I'll make it as small as that, which again is like a liberal estimate because that would arrive at a larger number overall. So let's say you have an area of 70 square miles that you think a Sasquatch inhabits to sustain itself. A home range is defined as the amount of area that an animal will move through or utilize in order to sustain itself. Within a home range, you have a territory, and that's that portion within that an animal will defend. And then within that, you have a core area, which is where they tend to spend the most time if they feel the most secure or the least threatened there. So you could posit this 70 square mile area that's probably in fairly rough terrain, at the very least densely forested, if not mountainous and rugged. And you think, well, this thing is living in there and it's moving around constantly as it sustains itself, probably subject somewhat to food availability and seasonality. When's it going to die? Oh, well, maybe sometime within the next, let's say if it's an adult and it's achieved adulthood, maybe it'll die sometime within the next, if we're being, again, let's say 10 years. Although I think it's probably more likely, like if you ran into a newly minted adult, something that's just reached maturity, it might live another 20 to 30 years. But let's just say 10 years. And that somewhere in this 70 square mile area, this thing will die 10 years from now or sometime within the next 10 years, let's say. Well, where are you going to begin to look for that? Are you going to assume that it's going to die In the wintertime, Krantz postulated something like that winter die-offs would be the most likely. And so you'd want to look for remains right after the coldest part of the winter. But where would you begin in an area of that size before an environment has the ability to recycle the animals that have died within it? Scavengers, birds, bacterial action, et cetera, et cetera. So the proposition alone is very difficult. But the other reality of that is, like, for those of us who are intimately familiar with the history of Bigfoot research, there has never been an effort to find bones. It's never happened. No one has ever tried this. Now, people might go hiking and keep an eye out. That certainly doesn't constitute an actual effort to recover the remains of something approximating a Sasquatch, should such things exist. And so we can easily look back in time and say, well, why hasn't anyone found bones? Well, number one, no one's looking. And then you could say, well, shouldn't someone have spontaneously stumbled upon them by now? Because there are people out there doing everything else under the sun other than looking for Sasquatch bones. And it's a valid question. But obviously, in this hypothetical model, you would not expect these animals to just drop dead, because that's not how animals with no superordinate predators die. They die slow deaths, typically, generally speaking. And so most people spend their time in designated areas, whether that's campgrounds, on designated trails, on, trout fishing streams, et cetera, et cetera. And so these animals don't just drop dead in a campground or drop dead on a trail or on some section of the Appalachian Trail, for example. And so you wouldn't necessarily expect that people doing what people do would result in the spontaneous contact with the remains of a very large, rare animal. Now, even if they did, I think in lieu of finding something immediately recognizable like a skull, people would just have no idea what they were looking at. I mean, if you saw a Sasquatch skull, that's something that looks like the Grover Krantz reconstruction of the Gigantopithecus skull, you'd think, man, that's something. You'd want to collect that and think that this has some value to someone somewhere. I've got to get this analyzed. But if it was something like a finger bone or a portion of a foot bone or a fragment of another bone, most people who would encounter something like that, they might have a multiple choice list in their minds of what that might belong to. And, an as yet unrecognized North American hominoid is not on that list. And so they're not going to collect it and take it to an expert or a lab and have it analyzed and looked at. So I think all of those things combine to set up a situation where we just wouldn't expect bones to be spontaneously tripped upon. What should happen is that people should somehow systematically execute a rigorous search for such things. But it's very daunting. And, I say that I'm speaking to myself, too. I've never gone out and actively looked for bones. And so I'm just as guilty as the people I'm speaking to. So, again, I'm including myself in this group. But, name one effort in the history of Sasquatch research that has been a coordinated and concerted effort to try to locate remains or bones. It's never happened. And so that's the number one reason that if such things exist, then their bones haven't been found yet.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. And for people who, I live in North Carolina, and we have 40 acres here. If you took, let's just say hypothetically for a second, somebody killed a Sasquatch 8 feet tall and put it somewhere on my property, do you know how long it would take me to search just my 40 acres? By the time I actually got to where the body was placed, it may be gone. And I think that's the thing that people don't realize when the vastness of this continent and the places that people have literally never been is far greater than most people can even wrap their imagination around. And I've often thought that I'm satisfied that there may have been bones collected. They're probably in bones somewhere in a box in some professor's office that's never been gone through, that may never be discovered, and they just don't know what they have. Like you said, if it's not immediately recognizable as, oh, this is something, it's just another bone, right? So I'm satisfied there are probably examples of these laying around and people don't even know they have them.
I think that's entirely possible. And again, we just have to think of this in terms of, like, statistically speaking, or at least as much as we possibly can, because I do hear, there's sort of the same old, like, apologetic defensive responses to these things. And so people tend to couch things in language of, like, the absolutes. And so I hear people say, well, you'd never find the bones of a black bear. No one's ever found this. And it's like, that's not true. What is true is that finding the remains of a naturally deceased black bear is extremely rare, and especially in proportion to the population of black bears in North America. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of these things in North America, and yet finding the remains of naturally deceased black bears is rare. It does happen. So this idea that no one ever finds, that's just not true. It's just extremely rare. Or of other more rare mammals like mountain lions. Finding the remains of a naturally deceased mountain lion is extremely rare, and they're much rarer animals than black bears are. They have, a more limited distribution and a smaller overall number, but it's very rare. And so if you posit something that is fewer in number than the black bear, or potentially fewer in number than mountain lions, at least where such things might co-occur, then you would expect naturally. I mean, I don't think I'm being unreasonable to say, well, given the hundreds of thousands of black bears and the rarity of finding their remains, again, of naturally deceased, we're kind of excluding roadkill and ones that are shot and that get away and die later, or ones that are poached or something like that. The naturally deceased individuals, if that's so rare, then I would assume responsibly that a rarer animal with a longer lifespan and in a wider distribution with larger home ranges, finding those would be even more rare. So it's possible, of course, if such things exist, but we just wouldn't. The expectation, I think, that bones would have been found is potentially, it's not unrealistic, but it's a big expectation. And then, to pair that with the expectation that should such bones be found, that they happen to be the most recognizable ones. I mean, again, look at Gigantopithecus. They lived across Asia for at least 2 million years. If we're going back to their predecessor, Indopithecus, that's 8.6 million years ago, across a huge portion of Asia for, again, 8 million years, roughly speaking. And we have a few jaws and about 1,000 teeth to show for it. A tenure of a massive span of Earth, a piece of real estate, let's say, and a long time. And so if this hypothesis is correct and they came here from Asia, maybe they've only been here for tens of thousands of years. Maybe they've only been here for a few 100,000 years. Who knows? But the expectation would be, well, if they were in Asia for this long and they only left this many fossils for us to find, and that's because of these key processes like the opening and formation of karst topography and those bones being deposited in there by accumulating agents, i.e. porcupines, that, dragged bones into their dens and ate them. And it just so happens that the teeth and jaws were sufficiently dense that the porcupines couldn't chew through them. And that's why that's all that remains. The expectation that we would have found bones by now is somewhat unrealistic. But again, you have to set up the proposition. So I'm sure I'll get accused of playing Bigfoot apologetics, or, playing Calvin ball or moving the goalposts or something like that. But that's just how I see it. So I don't see that as unreasonable in any way, shape, or form. It makes sense to me in that context, especially as, again, not to repeat the often trotted out chestnut that people repeat, but I am in the field a lot. I'm in viable habitat, let's say, a lot, and have been for a long time. And especially in southern Appalachia, that's where I spend most of my time, which has an abundance of black bears. And I've never found the remains of a naturally deceased black bear. And I'm off trail very often. And I'm clearly, examining and surveying and investigating, looking for signs of large animals. And that is in no way, shape, or form, proof that my proposition is correct. But I would say just experientially, I personally experienced the rarity of something like that. And so my expectations that I'll find bones is not very high, even though I'm out there often.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And that sort of, as we wind down, that leads me to, I guess, the final thing I want to talk about, and that is the collection of a specimen. I've said to people, and I often get crap for it, I think one of these things have to be shot and brought in. I just don't think there's any other way to prove it. We've had videotape. We've got pictures. We've got more castings of footprints. We've got hair evidence. We've got all these things, the anecdotal testimony of eyewitnesses. But in order to satisfy science and really get some answers, we've got to have a specimen. And I don't think it's very practical to think that somebody's going to go out and capture one of these things alive. I think they're very elusive. I think they're probably, as you alluded to earlier, ambush predators, which in and of itself means they're probably going to be a lot harder to ambush because they're ambush predators. So that said, I think we've got to have a specimen collected. And I do think, and I've mentioned this on the show before, I think these things have been shot through history. I've talked to people that have claimed to have shot them. I've heard other stories of people who have said they have shot and killed them, but yet no body. So I know you are a member of the North American Wood Ape Conservancy. So for those of us who don't know about the Conservancy, can you sort of give us the Cliff Notes version of what the North American Wood Ape Conservancy is and what's your mission? What are you guys out to do, or what are you out to prove?
Well, the Conservancy, the organization, is a collection of a diverse array of individuals. And I always, try to reiterate, like, I'm very much the low person on that totem pole, because there are legitimate field biologists and, there are current and retired professors and multiple PhDs and people with a lot more qualifications than me as somebody who's just who absolutely is passionate about and insatiably curious about the subject. But, I don't have a degree. I have no qualifications to be involved in this other than as hopefully trying my best to be a diligent citizen scientist. So this organization, they were formerly called the Texas Bigfoot Research Conservancy, and then adopted a new nomenclature of the North American Wood Ape Conservancy. Bigfoot and Sasquatch those terms have a lot of baggage associated with them. Association with hoaxes and, the sort of like tabloid representation or the sort of cartoon campfire monster representation. And so if these data represent real animals, they're clearly apes. So a designation like the North American Wood Ape grounds it a bit more and sort of is an attempt to divorce it from the association with the negative baggage that comes along with it. But it's impossible to entirely remove, the stigma of the Bigfoot topic, but essentially the group exists to try to validate the existence of the animal. And I guess one way that we could think about this, and one of my great friends in the organization, Daryl Collier, he and I co-host the organization's official podcast, Apes Among Us, and we just recorded a conversation last night that's going to be the next episode, so that'll be out very soon. So we were discussing this and saying, like, we're trying to test this hypothesis. Essentially, you have your null hypothesis, which is that there is no other anthropoid or hominoid species in North America. Ergo, all of the stories and the evidence are, the product of the human mind, whether voluntary or involuntary in terms of the sightings, or in the evidence that it would have to be voluntary, the voluntary fabrication, like the externalization of that imaginative form. That's the null hypothesis. There is no such thing. The alternate hypothesis is that there is another ape species in North America. The North American wood ape, the Sasquatch, call it what you will. And, I've found over the last 10 years or so that ape has become this very dirty word, which I find like really frustrating, because humans are apes. So if you postulate that these things are our closest living relatives, or if you think like I do that they're probably part of this Asian ape lineage, they're still apes. And so I tend to use technical language where possible because it removes the ambiguity and it's more clear. But I encounter people all the time who say, oh, you think they're just apes. It's like, well, I guess I'm just an ape too, right? So I use ape in the most technical sense of the sort of animal that's being posited here. So what we're trying to do is to test the ape hypothesis. Now, to do that efficiently or responsibly, you actually have to. We had this conversation, and so I don't want to say everything that I just said in another podcast that's about to come out, so that they cancel each other out with redundancy. But the only way to do that is to behave as if it exists. That's how you have to conduct that sort of test. And maybe to use an analogy that's pertinent to you in your line of work, in your history, your professional history, if you had a hypothesis that, someone was trying to break into a certain place that was under your purview, and you wanted to test that hypothesis. Well, if you went there in your cruiser and parked in front of the facility and had the blue lights on the whole time, you've not actually conducted the test, right? Because your test should be predicated on the idea that whoever's trying to break into this place is doing so because they think no one's looking and they think they can get away with it. But then if you announce your presence and you park in an obvious spot and you have the blue lights on, well, you're not really testing the hypothesis. So you have to behave as if this thing is going to occur in order to document it should it actually occur. And so that's what we're doing. So I know a lot of people think, in reality, that's what all of Sasquatch field research is either doing or is trying to do or should be doing, is that, of course, we're conducting ourselves as if the things exist, in fact, even though that hypothesis is as yet unproven to humanity at large or to our institutions, let's say. But if I were to go into the field, again, wearing bells and whistles and putting off like plumes of stinky cologne and wearing, neon green where I'm visible from hundreds of yards away, and then nothing happens, I hear no such ape, I see no such ape, I can hardly say that I've actually tested the hypothesis, right? So we operate primarily in an area that constitutes extremely viable habitat, that has produced a number of reliable observation claims over the years. Our own members have experienced their own observations and encounters there. Sign has been encountered in the form of tracks and other environmental sign, etc. And so we're constantly testing this hypothesis in an effort to do one of two things, either to recover a specimen by means, which could be a number of things, whether that's finding the remains of a naturally deceased individual or whether that's collecting a specimen should the opportunity arise. And we're also very interested in gathering other data. And that's to include, we've got a lot of talks about potentially trying to process eDNA, but we use these autonomous recording units to collect audio recordings from the field for months at a time from two different positions in this particular valley, hoping to capture characteristic vocalizations or other sounds. We've got this extensive camera array that we've installed last year that we've made a series of modifications to in hopes that this might result in photographs. We have people who serve as our camera corps who are trying to get photographs in the field. We use thermal imagers to get footage at night. So all of these things, I would say, are sort of housed under this idea that we are testing the ape hypothesis. But to your point, yes, a specimen is required. Now, a specimen could mean, again, one of many things. It could be a tooth. It could be, some portion of an animal. It could be an intact specimen. And there's many ways to arrive at those various things. But unfortunately, a specimen is necessary to demonstrate the validity of the theory if they do actually exist. And if they do exist, then certainly we have a right to know about it for a few reasons. Number one, because we occupy the landscape with these things. And number two, because our species are currently the caretakers of the planet, whether we like it or not. We're caretaking the planet because we're defending it from us. If you were to remove humans from the equation, well, they wouldn't need caretakers. So I say that, paradoxically, yes, it's our job to protect species. And what we're protecting them from most of the time is our own intervention in ourselves. So if these animals do occur in these habitats, then there might be some need for habitat protection. We just don't know. If they do exist, what are their habitat requirements? Well, no one knows. How many are there? Well, certainly they would benefit from protections that keep habitat from being segmented or fragmented or lost completely. And we have these success stories to show for it. Look at what we did to the grizzly bear, which was horrific, and then we brought it back. People think that it being delisted from the endangered species list is this bad thing. And it's like, no, that's the success story of what we were able to do with our intervention to bring that species back from the brink. Now, on the one hand, you have proponents who say, well, their Sasquatches are everywhere. They're prolific. They're ubiquitous. They're doing just fine. They don't need to be proven. And it's like, well, if that's the case, then what's the harm in proving them? Because they're doing just fine in spite of all of our human progress. And then there are other people that say, oh, well, what if they're critically endangered and intervening is what eventually kills them all off? And it's like, well, if that's the case, then it's already too late anyway. And we might as well know that they did occur to some degree that would validate, at least some of the claims and some of the evidence and some of the effort that's made towards it. And so that's essentially what we're trying to do. And so part of that is the willingness to collect a specimen should a safe opportunity arise. And it's a hot button issue for people. And, what I find myself, because we're all paradoxical creatures, right? And so this argument that it's ugly and very sad that animals have to be collected in order to be listed, that's true. And the argument that it's absolutely necessary to list animals so that they're understood and protected is simultaneously true. Both of those positions are correct. And so in testing this hypothesis, if the apes exist, a specimen is required. It's sad and it's ugly and it's necessary. Again, it doesn't have to be one that's like collected via dispatching a living individual. If you were to weigh all the options, that's probably the most efficient way to get the largest repository of genetic material. But there are other ways. There are other methods. And believe you me, because, I don't carry a long gun. Like, I'm not trying to collect one individually, but I am trying to facilitate that. It's necessary. But there's nothing that would make us or probably anyone else happier than if some institution would accept, let's say, photographs and or video along with environmental DNA that was suggested. If they said, look, that will constitute a type such that this can be listed and recognized, I think every single one of us would be over the moon about it. And the burden of even contemplating the collection of one could be taken off the proverbial shoulders. But, as we say in the South, you can wish in one hand and defecate in the other and see which one fills up first. I gave you the cleaned up version of that saying. You're from the South. You probably heard that too. So I could wish for things all day long to be different, to say that, I really wish that the most qualified field biologists and anthropologists were trying to solve this question or were at least as intensely curious about solving this question as I am, because I'm not that qualified, right? But until such time as they do so, I am trying to solve this question to resolve which of those two models, the ape species or the production of the human mind, is correct. And in order to do that, I have to continually test the ape hypothesis. I haven't seen one yet. I've had experiences that were consistent with the phenomenon. I'm convinced that the ape hypothesis is the correct one, but I'm willing to keep contending with this, knowing all the while that if I'm wrong, I'll never know, because you can't prove a negative, which is very daunting. But I do think it is a necessary pursuit, and that's essentially what we're engaged in and involved in, to the degree that we can do it as safely, responsibly, diligently, morally, and ethically as we possibly can.
Very well said, and I think we're all better off that you're out in the field trying to prove this. You're definitely one of the top researchers, in my opinion, in the field that takes a look at this in the right way and does it in a way that makes sense, and you present it so well to the people out there who may be on the fence or may be more skeptical. When they hear somebody like you on a show like this, it makes them understand that there are very smart people looking into this subject. There's real people out there who have seen these things and experienced these things, and there are real academics that are out there doing the citizen scientist work to prove this in the correct way. So I definitely think we're all better off that you're doing that, and I appreciate it very much. So in conclusion, Matt, we're going to start wrapping up, but in addition to doing the Apes Among Us podcast, what else do you have going on? Where can people find you? I know you're not terribly active on social media, but should somebody have something and say, hey, I want to reach out to Matt, how would they get in contact with you? And do you have any other appearances or anything else that you want to tell us about coming up?
I don't have any upcoming speaking engagements open to the public right now, although I really enjoy doing those things and interfacing with people and trying to, talk about some of these conceptual things and dispel a lot of the myths around the subject and some of the things that get propagated that I think are damaging, that corrode, the credible verisimilitude of the subject itself, which I think has been eroding for the last 20 years, maybe a little bit longer, unfortunately, because of the accumulation of outlandish claims and outlandish interpretations and hoaxes, etc. But, if people wanted to interact, I'm on Twitter at Pruitt Bigfoot, and I tweet like maybe 3 times a year, it seems like, so I don't engage on that very much. You can contact me via there or at mattpruittonline.com, which is just, I had to have some sort of like internet placeholder, and so there's like a little contact form. It sends me an email if people wanted to communicate that way. But I greatly enjoy being behind the scenes for the most part. I do a lot of behind the scenes things. I produce and edit Cliff and Bobo's podcast, Bigfoot and Beyond, which I greatly enjoy. I love both of those guys very much. And so, I love discussing these things, and I love, developing and expanding these conversations and asking these questions and seeing where they might go. And I think I enjoy like the behind the scenes things because, it's not like I have some body of evidence to put forth. Again, I've not cast tracks, that I've not got photographs or video or these things. Like I've recorded sounds, which, that's sort of the easiest thing to experience, right? Because you don't have to be close to something to hear it. And so I know something out there makes those sounds, but, I am, again, convinced that this biological reality is the most parsimonious solution. And I'm trying to explore that and test that. And I love these discussions. I really appreciate the invitation. And I'm happy to have more of those discussions with people that are interested. But I don't consider myself, you're very kind words, but I wouldn't say like top researcher in the field, because if I'm being totally honest, I mean, I've been gathering data and looking into it very deeply since starting in about 2002. And then I started going in the field in 2004. And that field work has just increased every year since then. I'm out there as much as I can be and trying to refine my own skills. And so it's, on one hand, there's this sort of thing that comes along with saying, wow, I've been doing this for a long time. And so therefore I have these perspectives, right? Because, I agree I hear this said very often. People say there's no experts, and there's certainly no experts in the animal, because we don't even know that the animal exists, right? But you can be an expert in the history of the subject because there's an available literature there. And I'm not saying that I am, but what I am saying is is there an available data set related to the history of the Sasquatch phenomenon or the history of Sasquatch research? Of course there is. Could you develop intimate familiarity with that information, i.e. expertise? Well, yes, you could, because you can buy those books and read them and reread them and then read comparative works in related disciplines. And so you should aim at expertise. And I do not think I'm an expert, but I'm aiming at developing an expertise with the history of this subject and related disciplines, to see if connections or correlations exist, et cetera. But, on the flip side of that, it's embarrassing to say, oh, yeah, I've been pursuing this since 2004. And people are like, oh, how many times have you seen them? And I'm like, never. How many tracks have you cast? None. Where's your catalog of photographs and videos? It doesn't exist because I've not captured those things, and so paradoxically it's like both good and bad to have pursued it for that long. So, but I certainly wouldn't say like, oh, I'm one of the top researchers. There are people that have accomplished a lot more and contributed more and pushed the needle forward, and a lot of those people are members of the NAWAC. But I think Cliff Barackman's contributions can't be overstated. I love Cliff. People from the past, John Green, Grover Krantz, et cetera. I think Jeff Meldrum continues to do great work. So I just try my best to develop that familiarity. And there's a saying that I'll paraphrase that, there exists this great well of knowledge, and every one of us should try our best to be a good cup, but a cup must never confuse itself with the well. And so that's the line I try to maintain at all times.
Very well said. I think that's the perfect ending for this episode. Thank you so much, Matt, for coming on and being so gracious with your time. And I really, really, really enjoyed the conversation. I would certainly love to have you back on the show. It sounds like we've got a lot more to talk about. I know you're working on a book. So obviously when you get that project done, we would love to have you back on the show and discuss that and many other things that may happen between now and then. I thank you so much for coming on, man.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'd love to come back. And I really appreciate the invitation. It's been a lot of fun.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And that's it for tonight's show, folks. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you guys next week.